The cave smelled of wet stone and old blood, and Kai pressed his back against the rock wall, listening to boots crunch through the underbrush outside. 3 men. Maybe 4. Close enough now that he could hear one of them laughing about the reward they would split once they dragged the girls back to the wagon. Behind him, a girl with bandaged eyes gripped his sleeve so tightly her nails left marks through the fabric. Another lay curled against the cave floor, fever sweat soaking through her torn dress, too weak to even whimper. The third stood frozen near the entrance, staring at Kai like he was either her salvation or the next person who would betray her. He had no sword worth the name, no armor that would stop a real blade, just a body that, by every measure of this world, belonged to a man people were supposed to fear and despise. And somehow, in less than a week, he had gone from waking up dead on the floor of his own apartment to standing in a cave full of strangers, deciding whether he was brave enough to die twice. It had not started here. It had not even started in this world. It started on an ordinary Tuesday, with a man who had spent more hours of his life inside a game than most people spend on actual hobbies. He worked a job that paid the bills and nothing more. He came home, heated up whatever was easiest, and logged in. That was the whole shape of his life, and he had never minded it. The game gave him something his days did not: clear goals, fair rules, a sense that effort actually led somewhere. He had been halfway through a late-night raid, eyes burning, half a bag of chips gone cold beside his keyboard, when his chest seized up like someone had reached inside it and squeezed. He did not remember pain so much as pressure, and then nothing. No tunnel of light, no voice explaining the rules, just a gap, the way a video skips a few frames during a bad connection, and then he was lying on his back, breathing in air that smelled like grass and wood smoke, instead of the stale heat of his apartment. He opened his eyes to a sky that was too blue, clouds shaped with an almost suspicious precision, and the unmistakable, bone-deep recognition of a place he had walked through 100 times on a screen. This was his game, the world he had spent years memorizing, except now the grass actually bent under the wind, and when he sat up too fast, his head spun with real, physical nausea instead of a loading icon. His first thought was relief, sharp and stupid. He was alive. Whatever had happened to his heart, it had not ended him completely. His second thought arrived when he caught his reflection in a puddle by the road. The face looking back was not his own. It was leaner, sharper around the jaw, with a faint scar above one eyebrow that he had definitely never had in either life. He recognized it anyway, the way you recognize a face from a story you have read too many times. He had fought this face before, as a boss, as a side character, as a name that showed up in item descriptions for the things this man used to sell. He was inside the body of a minor villain, a man tied to slavers and kidnappers, a background character whose entire narrative function in the game had been to get exposed and executed about 2 arcs into the story, so the real heroes could look righteous doing it. He laughed, once, a short ugly sound, because the alternative was screaming. He spent that first day doing what any sane person would do. He stayed quiet. He listened to the handful of men who clearly worked for him, picking up names and routines, piecing together just how deep this man's hands were in things he did not want to be part of. He learned he had access to coin, to a hidden lodge in the woods, to supplies that, in the game, had been little more than loot drops behind a locked door. He also learned, from a half-drunk conversation between 2 of his own men, that there were 3 girls being held a half-day's walk from here, meant to be sold somewhere south once the buyer arrived. In the game, this had been a quest he completed a dozen times for experience points. Free the girls, collect the reward, watch a cutscene where the villain screamed about loose ends before getting cut down by the actual protagonist. Kai was not the protagonist. He had never once believed himself capable of being anyone's hero, but he also could not sit in a hidden lodge eating bread paid for by trafficked children and call that surviving. So he told his men, in the flattest, most authoritative voice he could fake, that there had been a change of plans. The girls were being moved early. On his personal authority, no questions. He invented a rank on the spot, some intelligence division he half remembered from the game's lore, and watched the men nod like it explained everything. It was the first lie that built the myth. He did not know that yet. He found the girls in a cellar that smelled like mildew and fear, locked behind a door that gave way to the second key he tried, lifted straight off a sleeping guard's belt. The youngest, a girl who could not have been older than 10, flinched so hard when the light hit her that he almost turned around and left, certain that whatever he said next would only make things worse. Her name was Remy. She had a fever that made her skin feel like a stovetop under his hand, and when she spoke, her voice cracked on every other word. The second girl sat with her knees drawn to her chest, bandages wrapped crudely over both eyes, courtesy of an infection no one had bothered treating. She did not ask who he was. She only asked, very quietly, if he was here to hurt them too. The third was the one who watched him the longest before she said anything at all. Karen. Even half-starved and limping on a leg that clearly had not healed right after some old injury, she carried herself like someone who had decided fear was a luxury she could not afford yet. He told them he was getting them out. He did not tell them he had no real plan, no proper weapon, and no idea if the men outside would simply kill all four of them the moment they realized what was happening. He used the only currency he had, the lie that had worked once already. He was intelligence, he said. This was a sanctioned extraction. Anyone who interfered would answer for it personally. It worked because nobody expects a child trafficker to suddenly start talking like a man with the authority of a small army behind him, and because fear has a way of making people believe whatever story stops the pain the fastest. They made it out of the cellar. They did not make it far before someone realized the girls were gone. That was how Kai ended up exactly where this story began, in a cave half a day's walk from the lodge, with 3 men from Red Freed closing in through the trees, and a body count of 0 on his side of the ledger if it came to a real fight. Red Freed was not some shapeless threat whispered about in taverns. It was a working business, with routs, buyers, and enforcers who had killed before and would not lose sleep doing it again. The men outside answered to a woman the local cell called the broker, a person Kai had never met but had already heard described in the kind of tone people used for things they were afraid would hear them talking. He pressed his palm against the cave wall and tried to think the way he used to think in front of a screen, when death only meant a loading bar and a slightly annoyed sigh. Real death did not work that way. He had already learned that once. But he had also spent years memorizing every shortcut, every hidden cache, every absurd developer oversight tucked into this particular stretch of forest, back when it was just pixels and a quest marker. There was a smuggler's cache not 40 paces from this cave, buried under a fallen log that any ordinary person would walk straight past. He left Karen in charge of the other 2, told her in a low voice to stay silent no matter what she heard, and slipped out the back of the cave on legs that did not feel nearly steady enough for what he was about to do. The log was exactly where his memory said it would be, half-rotted, moss-thick along one side. He dug his fingers into the soft wood until it gave, and underneath, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived years of rain, sat a small chest. Inside were 3 vials of something that glowed faint gold even in daylight, and a worn leather case holding a handful of throwing knives that had once, in a different life, taken him 40 tries to retrieve from a hidden vault guarded by a boss 3 levels above where he should have been. He had never used a real knife to hurt a real person. He had thrown thousands of virtual ones. The voices in the trees grew louder. Someone called out that they had found tracks. Someone else laughed and said the villain who started this mess wouldn't get far carrying 3 sick girls through the woods. Kai closed his hand around the vials, feeling the warmth pulse faintly against his palm like something half alive, and allowed himself exactly 1 slow breath before he moved. He did not know yet that this single decision, made out of guilt and stubbornness rather than any grand plan, would be the first thread in a misunderstanding so large it would eventually have nobles, guildmasters, and the Holy Church convinced he commanded forces he had never even heard of. All he knew, crouched in the dark with stolen knives in his hand and a stranger's face staring back at him from every reflective surface he passed, was that he had run out of room to keep being afraid quietly. He moved back toward the cave low and fast, boots silent on wet leaves out of pure luck rather than skill, and found Karen already on her feet, pressing her good shoulder against the cave entrance like she meant to block it with her own body if it came to that. "They're close," she said. "Not a question." "I know." He held up the vials, the throwing knives tucked against his side. "I have something that might help. I don't know if it'll be enough." "It doesn't have to be enough." Her voice did not shake the way he expected. "It just has to buy time." He almost asked how a girl who knew how long locked in a cellar could sound steadier than he felt. And then he remembered that fear made different people armor themselves in different ways. His was sarcasm and overthinking. Hers, apparently, was a refusal to fall apart in front of people who needed her not to. Remy stirred against the far wall, lips cracked, murmuring something that might have been a name. The blind girl reached toward the sound without being able to see where it came from, and found Remy's hand on the second try. Kai uncorked one of the golden vials. The smell that rose from it was something between citrus and rainstorm, faint and strange. Nothing like the flat description the game had ever given it. "Drink this," he told Remy, kneeling beside her, voice lower than he meant it to be. "All of it. I promise it won't make things worse." She looked at him with the kind of trust that should never be handed to a stranger so easily, and drank. For 3 long seconds, nothing happened, and Kai's stomach dropped at the thought that maybe the items here didn't work the way they had on a screen, that maybe this whole plan had been built on nostalgia instead of fact. Then her breathing evened out. The flush in her cheeks faded from feverish red to something closer to normal. Her grip on his sleeve loosened, not from weakness this time, but because she no longer needed to hold on so hard just to stay conscious. Outside, a branch snapped much too close. Kai pressed the second vial into Karen's hands. "Get her to drink hers too. Quietly." He turned toward the cave mouth, throwing knives balanced awkwardly in a grip that felt nothing like the smooth, practiced motion his character used to have in 100 replayed cutscenes. His hands were shaking. He let them shake. There was no point pretending otherwise to himself, even if every instinct screamed at him to look calm in front of the girls. 3 men came around the tree line in a loose triangle, the kind of formation that told him they had done this before, that catching runaways was routine business rather than anything that cost them sleep. The one in front carried a short sword loosely, almost lazily, the way people carry things they have never had a reason to doubt. "There he is!" the man called out, not even bothering to raise his voice properly, like Kai's life was a minor inconvenience rather than a threat. "Boss said bring the girls back breathing. Didn't say anything about you." Kai's mouth went dry. He thought about every clever line his character might have delivered in the game, and found none of them anywhere close to his throat. What came out instead was simpler and truer. "They're not going back." The man laughed, short and ugly, and took a step forward. Kai threw the first knife before he had fully decided to. It was not a clean hit. It caught the man's forearm instead of anything vital, but the shock of it, the simple fact that the villain everyone underestimated had drawn blood at all, made all 3 men hesitate for exactly the half-second Kai needed. He grabbed a second knife and did not throw it yet. He let the silence stretch, let them look at the blood, let them recalculate whatever assumption had carried them confidently through these woods a minute ago. "There's an extraction team a mile out," he said, voice steadier now, leaning into the lie the way he had leaned into it back at the lodge, because it had worked once, and people in danger rarely stopped to question a confident voice. "You're already late reporting in. Your broker isn't going to be happy when she hears you let 3 trained men get held up by one target who wasn't even supposed to be a fight. It was almost entirely invention. He had no idea if Red Freed answered to anyone above the broker. No idea if there was truly an extraction team. No idea if any of this would hold for more than another minute." But the man with the bleeding arm exchanged a look with the other 2, the kind of look that meant doubt had already crept in, and doubt was the only weapon Kai actually had plenty of. Inside the cave, Karen finished forcing the second vial between the blind girl's lips, and within moments, the girl's hands stopped trembling against the cave floor. She blinked, slow and confused, the bandages still covering eyes that, underneath, had already begun to heal in ways none of them could see yet. Outside, the standoff held for one more breath, then broke. The lead man lunged. The lunge came fast, faster than Kai's body, for all its unfamiliar strength, was ready to answer. He twisted sideways more from instinct than skill, felt the short sword catch nothing but air and a thin slice of his sleeve, and answered with the only thing he had left in his hand. The second knife went in low, aimed at nothing more ambitious than a thigh, and it landed. The man staggered, swearing in a way that had nothing rehearsed about it anymore, and dropped to one knee in the mud. The other 2 froze again, watching their companion bleed for the second time in under a minute, and something in their faces shifted from annoyance into the early shape of real fear. Kai did not let the silence sit long enough for them to recover their nerve. "Tell your broker the extraction's already moving," he said, forcing his voice into something flatter and colder than he felt, the way he imagined an actual intelligence officer might sound after a long, boring day of ruining people's plans. "Tell her she's lucky I'm only taking the girls and not cleaning up the rest of this mess while I'm here." It was theater. He knew it was theater. but theater only works on people who don't know it's theater, and these two had already watched a man they outranked in confidence draw blood twice without breaking a sweat. The uninjured pair exchanged one last look, the kind shared by men deciding a paycheck was not worth dying over, and pulled their wounded companion back into the tree line without another word. Branches snapped, retreating rather than advancing, and then the forest went quiet except for the ordinary sounds of wind and birds that had gone still during the standoff and were only now remembering how to sing again. Kai's knees nearly gave out the second they were gone. He did not let them. He turned back toward the cave instead, telling his legs that collapsing could happen later, in private, once there was no one left who needed him standing. Karen met him at the entrance, one arm braced against the stone, the other curled protectively in front of the two younger girls behind her. Her eyes moved over him quickly, checking for wounds the way someone does when they have learned not to trust good news without proof. "They're gone?" she asked. "For now." He glanced past her at Remy, who had pushed herself up onto her elbows, color back in her face in a way that still struck him as faintly unreal. "How is she?" "Better." Whatever that was, it worked fast. Karen hesitated, then added quieter. "Nina can see light now. She told me before you came back. Just shapes, but light." The blind girl, Nina, lowered the edge of her bandage with shaking fingers, blinking hard against daylight that had been nothing but darkness for longer than Kai wanted to ask about. Tears slid down her face before she said a single word, and when she did speak, her voice cracked down the middle. "I can see your shadow," she said, "to no one and everyone." "I haven't seen a shadow in 2 years." Kai had to look away from that, because something about it hit harder than the fight had. He had handed out healing potions in this game more times than he could count, watched the little plus sign float up over a character's head, never once thought about what it might actually mean to give someone back a sense they had grieved as gone for good. It was different when it wasn't a number ticking upward on a screen. It was different when it was a girl pressing both hands over her mouth like she was afraid the light might vanish again if she made a sound. He cleared his throat, mostly to give himself something to do besides stand there feeling unprepared for gratitude. "We should move while we still have daylight. Aldia is the nearest city. If we push, we can make it most of the way before dark." "You're taking us home," Karen said. It wasn't quite a question, but it carried the shape of one, like she was still testing whether the words were safe to believe. "That's the plan," he said, and did not mention that the plan, like most of his plans lately, had been assembled about 30 seconds before he needed it. They left the cave with Remy walking under her own power for the first time in days, small steps but steady ones, and Nina holding loosely to Karen's sleeve, learning to trust shapes and shadows again, one careful glance at a time. Karen herself limped, the old injury in her leg clearly worse than she let on, but she refused outright when Kai offered to slow the pace for her sake. "I've waited long enough to go home," she said. "I can manage a limp." He gave her the third vial anyway, somewhere around the second hour of walking, when he caught her wincing every time her weight shifted onto that leg. She argued for exactly 4 seconds before the pain won out over her pride, and after she drank it, he watched something in her face go slack with relief he suspected she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. By the time the swelling faded and her stride evened out beneath her, the sun had begun sliding toward the tree line, throwing long gold light across the forest path. She tested the leg with a few experimental steps, then a longer stride, then something close to a jog, before catching herself and slowing back to a walk, almost embarrassed by her own excitement. "It doesn't hurt," she said, mostly to herself. "It actually doesn't hurt." "Good," Kai said, and meant it more than the short word let on. They reached the outer edge of Aldea as the sky bruised purple at the horizon, torches already lit along the city wall, guards moving in slow, bored patterns until they spotted the 4 travelers approaching out of the tree line at an hour when most sensible people were already behind locked doors. Recognition hit fast once Karen stepped into the torchlight. A guard's eyes went wide, then wider, and within a breath he was shouting back over his shoulder for someone to fetch the captain, fetch the Duke's men, fetch anyone who needed to know that the missing girls had just walked out of the forest on their own 2 feet. Kai felt the attention swing toward him a half-second later, and every instinct he owned told him to step back into the shadows before someone asked a question he didn't have a safe answer for. "Who brought you back?" the guard demanded, looking past Karen at the stranger beside her, a man in plain, mud-stained clothes who carried himself like he very much did not want to be looked at. Karen answered before Kai could decide whether silence or another lie served him better. He did, she said. He found us. He got us out. And you are? The guard's gaze fixed on Kai now, sharp with the kind of suspicion reserved for men who show up out of dark forests with 3 noble adjacent girls in tow, and no obvious explanation for either. Kai's mind raced through every excuse he had used so far, and landed, almost by reflex, back on the lie that had carried him this far. Intelligence Division. I was already tracking the group responsible. Finding them was incidental to the assignment. It was a terrible answer if anyone thought about it for more than 5 seconds. No proper intelligence officer wandered out of a forest alone, in commoner's clothes, with no escort and no paperwork. But the guard did not have 5 seconds to spare, not with the Duke's missing daughter standing in front of him very much alive, and so he simply nodded, filed the strange answer away as someone else's problem, and waved them all through the gate. Word moved faster than Kai expected. By the time they reached the upper district, lanterns were being lit 2 streets ahead of them, doors opening, faces appearing in windows, a murmur rolling forward through the city like a wave outrunning its own source. Someone had already run ahead to the Aldi household. Someone else had apparently decided the story was worth shouting to neighbors before all the facts were confirmed. The gates of the Aldi estate were already swinging open when they arrived, and Duke Aldi himself came down the front steps 2 at a time. None of the careful dignity nobles were supposed to carry intact when his daughter ran the last few steps into his arms. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The Duke held Karen like he was still confirming with his hands what his eyes were already telling him, and over her shoulder, his gaze found Kai standing awkwardly near the gate, half a step from bolting the moment this got complicated. "You found her," the Duke said, voice rough. "You found all 3 of them." "I had help," Kai said, which was true in the sense that the help had been a decade of memorized item locations rather than any living person, but he saw no reason to clarify that part. The Duke studied him with an expression Kai recognized from 100 game cutscenes, and did not enjoy seeing aimed at his own face. The particular look of a powerful man recalculating how much he owed someone, and how much that debt was about to cost him to repay. "Whoever you are," the Duke said slowly, "you have my gratitude, and you will have whatever you require to settle this debt properly." "That's not necessary," Kai said quickly, already backing half a step toward the gate. "I was glad to help. I don't need anything in return." It was, without question, the worst possible thing he could have said. In a city where every noble debt came with an expected price, where favors were currency and obligations were tracked like ledgers, a man who rescued 3 girls, including the Duke's own daughter, and then refused payment, did not read as humble. He read as someone operating on a level so far above ordinary reward that gold meant nothing to him. Kai did not know that yet, standing there exhausted and mud-streaked, wanting nothing more than to disappear back into whatever quiet corner of this city would let him sleep. He only knew that the Duke's eyes had gone thoughtful in a way that made the back of his neck prickle, and that Karen, watching the whole exchange from beside her father, was looking at him with an expression that had stopped being simple gratitude several minutes ago. He turned to leave before anyone could ask him to stay for the inevitable celebration he wanted no part of, already rehearsing the excuse he'd give about needing to file a report that did not exist, for a division that did not exist, to superiors who, as far as he knew, lived nowhere but inside his own desperate improvisation. He made it exactly to the gate before the Duke's voice stopped him. "At least tell me your name," the Duke said, "so I know whose debt this is." Kai hesitated half a second too long, long enough that several names from his old life, and several more from this villain's reputation, tangled uselessly in his throat, before he settled on the one that felt safest, vague enough to mean nothing to anyone who might recognize the man he used to be. "Shikoku," he said. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. It was simply not the whole truth, which by now had become the closest thing he had to a personal motto. He left before the Duke could ask anything else, slipping out through streets still buzzing with half-formed rumors, none of which yet had his face attached to them, though that too was a problem with a very short shelf life. Behind him, in the warm light of the Aldi estate, Karen stood watching the gate long after he'd disappeared through it, one hand pressed absently to a leg that no longer hurt, already turning the stranger's name over in her mind, like something she intended to keep. Morning came to Aldia with the kind of energy a city usually reserved for festivals it hadn't planned for. Kai woke in the cramped rented room he'd found near the lower market, the kind of place that asked no questions as long as the coin was real, and lay there for a long minute listening to the unmistakable sound of a city talking about something it couldn't stop talking about. He told himself it probably wasn't him. He told himself that twice more before he gave up and went to find food, mostly to prove to his own nerves that he could walk outside without the sky falling. The sky did not fall. The conversation, however, found him anyway. Two merchants near the bread stall were arguing, not about prices, but about whether the man who'd pulled the Duke's daughter out of Redfried's hands had come from the capital or from somewhere further, somewhere with a name people only said in lowered voices. A woman behind them insisted she'd heard it from a guard directly, 3 trained slavers, and the stranger hadn't even drawn a proper weapon before they ran. Kai bought his bread, said nothing, and left before his face could betray exactly how much he knew about how inaccurate all of it already was. By midday, the story had grown a title. By evening, it had grown an organization to go with it. He learned the second part secondhand, from a boy hawking news sheets who shouted it loud enough to reach 3 streets over. A single operative, acting alone, believed connected to Vertar, the Empire's most secretive intelligence arm, had infiltrated Redfried's regional operation and extracted 3 hostages without backup or casualties on his side. The boy didn't know the man's name. Somebody 2 streets back apparently did, and it had already started circulating as Shikoku, spoken with the particular reverence people use for things they don't understand but very much want to. Kai sat down hard on the nearest bench. He had given a fake division to one guard, half improvised, half remembered from old lore text he'd skimmed years ago in a game wiki. He had not expected an entire city to treat it as confirmed intelligence within a single day. He understood, distantly, that this was how rumors worked, that they fed on confidence and grew regardless of what was actually true, but understanding it intellectually did very little to slow the speed at which his stomach dropped. He decided, with the kind of clarity that only comes from genuine panic, that the correct response was to disappear as completely as possible until the story burned itself out. This plan lasted approximately 1 day. It collapsed the moment Garag, master of the local treasure hunters guild, personally visited every inn within the lower district, asking after a man matching Kai's description, ostensibly to deliver a formal letter of thanks from House Aldi, though the tremor in his voice suggested gratitude was not the only emotion involved. Garag was not a small man, nor an easily rattled one. He had run the guild for over a decade, weathered dungeon collapses, bandit wars, and at least one minor uprising among his own ranked hunters. None of that experience seemed to be helping him now. "I only need a moment of his time," Garag told the innkeeper at the 3rd establishment he tried, his voice pitched somewhere between professional courtesy and barely restrained nerves. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I would simply like to personally extend the guild's gratitude before he decides our hospitality wasn't worth the visit." He found Kai eventually, not through any clever deduction, but because Kai made the mistake of buying dinner from the one stall Garag happened to be standing near. The guildmaster went very still the moment their eyes met, the way a man goes still when he suspects sudden movement might be the last thing he does. "You're him," Garag said. It wasn't really a question. The one from the Aldi rescue. Kai considered, briefly and seriously, simply denying it and walking away. He decided against it, mostly because Garag's expression suggested he would not survive the disappointment of being wrong twice in 1 week, and Kai found he did not have it in him to be the reason for that. "I'd rather not make a scene," Kai said instead, which was as close to confirmation as he intended to offer. Of course. Garag actually took a step back, hands raised slightly, the universal gesture of a man trying very hard not to provoke something he didn't understand. "I only wanted to say, on behalf of the guild, that anything you need, any resources, any standing, it's yours. We don't ask questions of men operating at your level." "My level," Kai repeated carefully. "The kind that walks into a Redfried cell alone and walks out with 3 hostages and no losses." Garag's voice dropped lower, almost reverent. "We don't get many of those. Most of us go our whole careers without seeing it happen once." Kai opened his mouth to explain that it had mostly been a stolen knife, a 40% lucky throw, and a decade of memorized item locations, and then closed it again, because he could already tell, with the dull certainty of a man watching a landslide start somewhere above him, that nothing he said now would slow this down. "I appreciate the guild's gratitude," he said instead, settling for the safest possible sentence. "I'd prefer to keep a low profile, if that's all right." "Whatever you need," Garag said immediately, in the tone of a man who would have agreed to almost anything in that moment. Low profile, understood completely. It was not, in fact, understood completely, because within 2 days, the guild had quietly arranged a modest residence on the city's edge, in Kai's name, paid for in full, along with a standing line of credit at 3 of the city's better-known shops. Garag framed it as standard procedure for hunters of unverified but clearly exceptional rank. Kai understood it as the guild's polite, terrified way of making sure he had no financial reason to ever feel disrespected by them. He tried to refuse the residence. He was informed, gently but firmly, that the paperwork had already been filed. Around the same time the residence appeared, so did the first real conversation with Lifia. He met her properly outside the Aldi estate, where he had gone reluctantly, summoned by a polite but immovable note from the Duke requesting his presence for what was described only as a small gathering of thanks. Kai had hoped to slip in, accept whatever this gathering required, and slip out again before anyone noticed him too closely. Lifia noticed him immediately. She was Karen's older sister and resembled her enough that Kai recognized the shape of her face before anyone introduced them, though where Karen's expression tended toward careful and watchful, Lifia's settled naturally into something sharper, more amused, like she found most situations at least a little bit funny and saw no reason to hide it. "So you're the one," she said, before he'd even fully stepped through the garden gate. "My sister hasn't stopped talking about you since she got back. Neither has half the household staff, frankly." "I'd rather she stopped," Kai said honestly. That made Lifia laugh, a short, surprised sound, like she hadn't expected the legendary rescuer to sound quite so tired and quite so unimpressed with his own legend. "Most men in your position would be enjoying this. You look like you'd rather be facing down Red Freed again. At least with Red Freed, I knew roughly what was happening." "And here you don't?" "Here," Kai said carefully. "People seem to know things about me that I don't know myself." Lifia studied him for a long moment, head tilted slightly, in a way that made him distinctly uncomfortable, like she was looking for the seams in a story everyone else had already accepted as solid fact. He had the unsettling sense, even in that first conversation, that she was paying closer attention than anyone had paid him yet, and that closer attention from Lifia was probably more dangerous to his secret than the open reverence of guild masters and dukes. "You're strange," she said eventually, though not unkindly. "Everyone else in this city's decided you're some kind of legend. You walk around like you're hoping nobody looks at you twice. Maybe I just don't like crowds. Maybe." She did not sound convinced. Or maybe legends don't usually look quite this nervous about being thanked. She left it there, that day, though Kai would learn over the following weeks that Lifia rarely let an interesting thread go entirely. She found reasons to be present whenever the Aldi household had business with him, asked questions that sounded casual but never quite were, and watched him with the patient curiosity of someone slowly assembling a puzzle she had decided was worth solving. He told himself more than once that her attention was simply natural curiosity about a stranger who'd saved her sister. He told himself this less and less convincingly as the weeks went on, particularly on the evenings she lingered after official business concluded, finding small excuses to keep the conversation going a few minutes longer than it strictly needed to. The other thread that pulled him back toward the Aldi estate, again and again, despite every instinct telling him to stay invisible, was Nina. She had recovered fully within the first week, the last traces of damage from her blindness fading until her eyes, once permanently bandaged, simply worked the way eyes were supposed to work. She belonged, it turned out, to a family with close ties to the Holy Church, and word of her recovery had reached church circles almost as fast as word of the rescue itself had reached the rest of the city. A representative of the church, a quiet, soft-spoken woman named Sister Aveline, came to see Kai personally, ostensibly to discuss a donation in gratitude for Nina's healing. The conversation lasted considerably longer than any simple thank you required, largely because Sister Aveline kept circling, gently but persistently, around questions about the nature of the elixir he'd used, where such things could be obtained, and whether the church might be permitted to study even a single additional dose, should one exist. Kai gave evasive answers and meant every one of them, because the truth, that he carried a small, dwindling stockpile of items lifted from a video game's hidden caches, was not an explanation any sane listener would accept, and would likely raise far more dangerous questions than it answered. The church doesn't often see healing of that completeness, Sister Aveline said carefully, watching him with the calm, patient attentiveness of someone used to extracting truth from people who didn't want to give it. Even our most blessed clergy struggled to restore sight lost that long. Whatever you used, it isn't something common. It was something rare, Kai said, which was true. I don't have more of it to offer, I'm sorry to say. That's a shame. Her gaze lingered a moment too long. The church would value the chance to understand it better, should circumstances ever change. He left that meeting with the distinct, uneasy sense that he had just become interesting to an institution far larger and more patient than a single noble household. An institution that did not forget questions simply because they went unanswered the first time. Nina herself, for her part, treated him with an open, uncomplicated gratitude that Kai found both touching and faintly unbearable. She sought him out whenever he visited the estate, full of questions about the world now that she could see it properly again, insisting on walking beside him through the garden paths just to prove to herself, again and again, that her eyes still worked. I used to dream in shapes only, she told him once, sitting on a low garden wall while late afternoon light spilled gold across the grass. Just outlines. I'd forgotten what color even looked like in dreams, until you gave me that back. I didn't give you anything, Kai said, uncomfortable, as he always was, with credit that landed too close to the truth he was hiding. The elixir did the work. You found the elixir. You carried it through a forest full of men trying to kill you. You gave it to me instead of selling it for whatever a thing like that must be worth. She looked at him steadily. I don't think you understand how rare that actually is. He didn't have a good answer for that, so he said nothing, and let the silence sit there between them, comfortable in a way he hadn't expected silence with a near stranger to feel. It was, he would later realize, somewhere around this point, surrounded by a guild that feared him, a noble house that owed him, a sister who watched him too closely, a girl who'd gotten her sight back because of him, and a church quietly taking notes on everything he did, that the myth of Shikoku stopped being a rumor he could simply wait out. It had become a structure with weight of its own, built entirely out of misunderstandings he had never corrected, and every day he let it stand unchallenged, it grew one story taller. The formal reward came 2 weeks later, delivered with the kind of ceremony that made Kai's stomach twist the entire walk to the estate. Duke Aldi had assembled it himself, apparently unwilling to let gratitude sit as a vague promise any longer. A small chest of gold, a deed to the residence the guild had already arranged, and a sealed letter bearing the Aldi family crest, the sort of document that functioned less as a thank you note and more as a standing invitation into rooms Kai had no business entering. This isn't payment, the Duke told him, in front of enough witnesses that refusing gracefully had become nearly impossible. Payment would insult what you did. Consider this an acknowledgement. A door, should you ever need one opened. Kai accepted it because the alternative was making a scene in front of half the city's notable families, all of whom had turned out for the occasion with the eager curiosity of people who suspected they were watching history get written and didn't want to miss the page. He noticed, standing there holding a sealed letter that effectively made him untouchable in 3 different social circles he had never asked to join, that Lifia was watching him from across the courtyard with an expression that had stopped pretending to be simple curiosity weeks ago. She found him afterward, away from the crowd, near the side gate where he always seemed to end up whenever a gathering grew too large for his comfort. You hate this, she said, not really a question. I don't hate it. He turned the sealed letter over in his hands, unsure where to even put something like this. I just don't know what to do with it. Most people would know exactly what to do with a duke's personal favor. Most people probably earned it more cleanly than I did. Lifia tilted her head, that same sharp attention settling over her face, the look that always made him feel like a puzzle halfway solved. You keep saying things like that. Like you think you don't deserve any of this. Maybe I don't. You pulled 3 girls out of a slaver's hands and walked away asking for nothing. Her voice softened, losing some of its usual edge. Whatever you think you are, Shikoku, that's not nothing. That's not something you talk yourself out of by being uncomfortable with a gift. He didn't have an answer for that. He rarely had a good answer when Lifia spoke to him like she actually meant to be heard, rather than simply making conversation, and the silence that followed felt different from the silences he usually left hanging when he didn't want to lie outright. You'll get used to it, she said eventually, when he still hadn't responded. The attention, eventually. I'm not sure I want to. No, she agreed, something almost fond creeping into her voice. I don't think you do. That might be the most convincing part of all this. Honestly, everyone else who's ever earned a reputation like yours wanted it. You're the first one I've met who looks like he's bracing for it to be taken away. She left before he could decide whether that observation comforted him or unsettled him more than anything else she'd said so far. The guild's response to the formal reward was, if anything, more excessive than the Duke's. Garag personally oversaw the drafting of papers granting Kai an honorary rank several tiers above what any unverified hunter should reasonably hold. Justified internally, Kai later learned, by a closed-door argument among the guild's senior staff that essentially amounted to nobody wanting to be the one who insulted a man capable of clearing a red-freed cell with a stolen knife and no backup. He tried to decline the rank. Garag's face went through several stages of polite panic before settling on a compromise that satisfied no one. The rank would simply remain on file, unused, in case Kai ever required it. Word of the rank, predictably, spread anyway. By the time autumn settled properly over Aldea, Shikoku had become something closer to local folklore than rumor. Children reenacted the cave rescue in market squares, usually with wildly inaccurate details that nonetheless got the broad shape right. A man, alone, outnumbered, who simply refused to lose. Merchants who had never met him claimed distant family connections to embellish their own reputations. A traveling bard, somewhere in the lower district, had already composed 2 separate verses about the rescue, neither of which Kai could listen to without wanting to physically leave the country. He told himself, repeatedly, that this would fade. Cities forgot things. Rumors had short lives. He simply needed to stay quiet, stay unremarkable in every interaction that didn't strictly require otherwise, and wait for Aldea's attention to drift toward whatever scandal or spectacle came next. The Holy Church did not appear to be waiting for anything. Sister Aveline returned a second time, and then a third, each visit framed as routine pastoral interest in Nina's continued well-being, each conversation drifting, with the same patient persistence as before, toward questions about rare elixirs, hidden caches, and the kind of knowledge a man might possess if he'd spent considerable time somewhere the church had no records of. You understand, she told him, during the third visit, in a garden that had become an uncomfortably regular meeting place. The church doesn't make a habit of prying into the affairs of men who do good work. We're grateful for what you did for Nina, genuinely. But, Kai said, because there was clearly a but coming. But healing of that completeness doesn't simply appear in a forest cache by accident. Things like that have origins, sources. We'd be remiss not to wonder where. She smiled, gentle and unthreatening, in a way that did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. There are factions within the church, even now, taking a renewed interest in old prophecies about hidden blessings, about men who arrive from nowhere, carrying gifts no one can properly explain. I only mention it because I'd rather you hear it from someone who means you no harm, before you hear it from someone who might frame it less kindly. What kind of factions? Kai asked, careful to keep his voice even. New ones, eager ones. Something in Aveline's expression tightened, just slightly, a crack in her usual calm. There's a growing movement within certain church circles, convinced that recent events, yours among them, signal something larger, a returning blessing, a sign the divine hasn't abandoned the old promises after all. She paused. Movements like that tend to want figureheads, whether the figurehead consents to the role or not. Kai felt something cold settle in his stomach. The particular dread of a man realizing his lies had outgrown not just a city, but an institution with the patience and reach to make his disappearance considerably harder than it already was. I'm not anyone's figurehead, he said. I believe you, Aveline said, and the sincerity in her voice was almost worse than suspicion would have been. I'm not sure that will matter as much as you'd like it to. She left him with that, and with no further answers about who exactly made up this rising faction, only the unsettling certainty that somewhere within the largest religious institution on the continent, people had already started building a story around him that he had no part in writing, and no clear way to stop. He found Lifia again that evening, more out of needing someone to talk to than any clear plan, and told her, in careful, edited pieces, about the church's growing interest. He left out the parts about elixirs and game knowledge, the parts that would unravel everything if she pulled too hard on them, but he let her see enough of his unease that she stopped teasing him within the first minute of the conversation. A religious faction? She repeated slowly. sitting across from him on the low garden wall that had become their unofficial meeting spot. Built around you. Apparently, that's not a small thing, Shikoku. For once, there was no humor in her voice at all. The church doesn't usually move quickly on anything. If they're already talking about figureheads and prophecies this soon, that means something's pushing them. Pressure from somewhere. I don't even know what I'm supposed to be the sign of. Does it matter? Once people decide you're a sign of something, the something tends to right itself. She studied him for a long moment, the easy amusement she usually wore replaced by something more careful. You should be worried, not about the church wanting to thank you, about the church wanting to use you. I know, do you? She leaned forward slightly. Because you've spent every week since that cave acting like the worst thing that could happen is people liking you too much. This is different. This is people deciding what you're for, whether you agree or not. He didn't have an answer for that either, and the lack of one sat heavier in his chest than any of the silences before it. The days that followed brought no clarity, only more weight. The guild's honorary rank, still officially unused, somehow found its way into a conversation between two visiting nobles from a neighboring territory, who left Aldia convinced Shikoku was a confirmed agent of Vertar operating under deep cover. A story that would, within weeks, travel considerably further than Kai had any ability to track or correct. Karen, for her part, remained the one constant who never seemed to want anything complicated from him. She visited the small residence the guild had arranged, usually under the thin pretense of returning some borrowed item or checking that he was eating properly, and her presence, unlike nearly everyone else's, asked nothing of him beyond simple company. "You look tired," she told him, on one such visit, settling into the single worn chair his sparse residence offered while he stood awkwardly near the window. "More tired than you did right after the cave, even. It's been a complicated few weeks, because everyone keeps deciding who you are without asking you first." It wasn't really a question, and the accuracy of it startled him slightly, coming from her. Something like that. She was quiet for a moment, turning over whatever she wanted to say next, and when she finally spoke, her voice had the same steady, unshaken quality it had carried back in that cave. The voice of someone who had decided panic solved nothing and meant to keep proving it. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't care what the guild thinks you are, or what the church decides to make of you. I know what you actually did. You came into that cellar when you didn't have to, and you didn't ask for anything after. That's the only part of this that's ever mattered to me." It was, of everything anyone had said to him since that night in the woods, the closest any of it came to making him feel like less of a fraud. He still hadn't told her, or Lithia, or anyone, the full truth of what he actually was. A man who'd died once already, wearing a stranger's face, surviving on memorized loot tables and a stubborn refusal to be the villain his body had apparently been written to become. He wondered, sometimes, what any of them would do with that truth, whether Karen's quiet loyalty would survive learning the rescue had been built on game knowledge rather than the deep, secret heroism the city had decided to credit him with. He didn't test it, not yet. Some truths felt too dangerous to risk on anything less than certainty that the people hearing them would still be standing afterward. The cliffhanger arrived without warning, the way most real turning points do, on an otherwise unremarkable evening when a runner from the Aldi estate found him at the residence, breathless and pale, carrying a message that had clearly been delivered to the Duke first and passed along with considerable urgency. The new church faction had a name now. Sister Aveline's warnings had solidified into something with structure, with leadership, with an agenda that had moved, in the space of a few short weeks, from quiet speculation to open declaration. They called themselves the Awakened Light, and they had announced, publicly, before half the city's clergy, that the recent miracles surrounding the man called Shikoku were no accident. They believed he had been sent. And somewhere in that growing crowd of believers, Kai understood with a sinking, certain dread, were people who would not be satisfied with him simply staying quiet, staying humble, staying out of sight. They wanted their sign to step forward. And he had no idea, standing in his small borrowed residence, with the message still trembling in his hands, how much longer he could keep being someone he had never actually claimed to be.